Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see that most of you are wide awake, because generally after lunch sessions, it's the most difficult one, because that's when slowly you see heads dropping one by one, because everyone just, probably the food just makes them a bit sleepy or tired, or you're just very content, so they fall asleep. But anyway, my topic for this afternoon, a bit different from the rest, tax law and sports. So who here has had any encounter when it comes to taxation? Okay, Cheng, Foong has lots of tax issues. Okay, I understand in the course of conversation with some of you earlier today that tax is an issue of concern to a lot of tax associations and even sportsmen themselves. What I'll be sharing with you today would be basically just on a touch and go basis. I wouldn't go into too much detail, simply because if I go into too much detail, then I'll get too technical and whatnot. So I'll just share with you some cases which I've come across involving tax and sports. First slide that I have, as you can see here, some of the very well-known sportsmen. What do these sportsmen have in common? If you look at the picture on the top left, there's Manny Pacquiao, Andre Agassi, Lewis Hamilton, Lionel Messi. All of these sportsmen, in some way or another, have had tax issues in the past. For Lionel Messi, Lewis Hamilton, Manny Pacquiao, they are presently, these are very recent newspaper articles that I came across in the course of research. And essentially what is happening here is, these individuals are being accused of evading payment of taxes. Okay? Manny Pacquiao, he's a Filipino person, professional boxer based in the US, or rather he competes a lot in the US. And in the course of his career, he has earned over $300 million. Recent winnings in one of his most recent matches, he won $20 million. And obviously, a lot of money. Tax authorities in the US and Philippines are all trying to grab hold of this big part of the pie. Okay? So presently, he is being targeted for tax evasion in the US and Philippines. And of course, this dispute about his boxing earnings, about where it should be taxed and how much he should be taxed. From what I read very briefly in the newspaper articles, there's no decisions at the moment because it's currently being litigated. He's I'm not too sure where he's a tax resident, but essentially, Philippines is trying to grab hold of some of his earnings, and the US as well is trying to get hold of some of that. When it came to Lionel Messi, he is also caught in a tax dispute at the moment. As we all know, he's a very famous football captain, FIFA World Player of the Year a few times, and he is presently about to face trial for tax evasion. Okay. In Lionel Messi's case, he is essentially accused of defrauding tax authorities. Okay, this is willingly defrauding payment of taxes, apparently. And this amounts to 4 million euros. The income that's presently being disputed relates to his image rights, which includes his contracts with Adidas, with Pepsi, P&G, as well as a food company known as Kuwait Food Company. He is suspected, him and his father actually, the two of them, are suspected of avoiding paying Spanish tax by using companies situated in Belize and Uruguay to sell rights to use Messi's image. Okay? The lower court, which has decided Messi's case, essentially ruled that in this type of crime, it is not necessary for someone to have complete knowledge of all the accounting and business operations, nor the exact quantity, or rather, it is sufficient to be aware of the design to commit fraud and consent to them. So essentially what judge is saying, even if you're not aware of the accounting treatment or your business operations or whatnot, if at the end of the day there is intention to evade or defraud tax authorities, you commit fraud, you consent to them, that essentially amounts to tax evasion. Okay? Lewis Hamilton. What I came across wasn't actually a tax case. It was essentially an article whereby a British citizen was essentially complaining about how Lewis Hamilton, in his competitions and whatnot, every time he wins a race, he'll take out the Union Jack and wave it around, saying, "Oh, I'm so proud to be British. I'm winning this for my country." But fact of the matter is, he is not paying taxes in the UK. Okay? So there are a lot of unhappy British taxpayers out there who are saying, "Look, you're not paying British tax money. Why are you waving around the Union Jack? You are not entitled to do so." Okay? And what I found out is, essentially Lewis Hamilton, he left Britain for Switzerland at the young age of 22. Okay? Obviously, Switzerland, it's a tax haven, you don't pay much taxes in Switzerland. And now he's moved on to becoming a tax resident in Monaco. Maybe better tax rate, or completely tax-free on all of his earnings. And what I found out also is he earns £16 million a year in terms of salary. So can you imagine in the course of his career how much money he has accumulated? Okay? And he is also spoken of as F1's first 250 million British pounds man. Okay, a lot of money there. So the few articles that I've read on Lewis Hamilton, people are just not happy that he's waving around the British flag, when, as you know, the British economy is not doing so well. He could have injected some money into that economy. Okay? All right. So essentially, you can see here that there's a lot of tax issues involving athletes, especially when they compete all around the world. You go to the US Open or you go to Wimbledon and you get players from all around the world and they get their winnings. Question then arises, who gets to have a chunk of this pie? Okay, who gets to tax it at the end of the day? All right, let me just take you through some of the boring stuff. Okay, the Malaysian tax provisions, very boring stuff, but something which will be useful for you to know. So, looking at the scope of charge, essentially in Malaysia, not all taxes are subject to tax. Okay? Income tax is generally imposed on income of any person accruing in or derived in Malaysia. There is presently a proviso, which is stated in Schedule 6, paragraph 28(1) of the Income Tax Act. And this essentially says that income of any person other than a resident company carrying on the business of banking, insurance, sea or air transport. So the income you receive in Malaysia from outside Malaysia is presently exempted from tax. Okay? So essentially, you're a tax resident in Malaysia, you go about doing your business here. Whatever income you receive from your business in Malaysia, that is clearly subject to tax. But let's just say, for example, you have some monies, extra monies at hand, and you decide to invest it abroad. You decide, for example, to invest it in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and from there, you receive, gains from your investment. When you bring it back, what this provision essentially says is that additional gain that you obtain from your dealings abroad, that is not subject to tax in Malaysia. Okay? Of course, as I mentioned before, not all incomes are subject to tax. Section 4 of the Income Tax Act essentially outlines the different categories of income that is subject to tax in Malaysia. Section 4 and Section 4 capital A. So this would be things like your business income, your employment income, your interest, dividend, pensions. Those would be the kind of income that's subject to tax in Malaysia. Or if you're a non-resident in Malaysia, your income will be subject to tax pursuant to Section 4 capital A. And this is very limited in instances whereby services are rendered in Malaysia in respect of technical services and advice and whatnot. There are certain conditions that needs to be met. Right? And if you were to go through the Malaysian income tax provisions, you also see that there's no specific provisions addressing sports or sportsmen, so to speak. So in that regard, we look at the general provisions and obviously the interpretations that apply thereon. For business income, okay, so if you're in the business, for example, of, training athletes or manufacturing sports goods or something to that effect, where the business operations are carried on in Malaysia, as I explained to you earlier, the income of that person is deemed to be derived from Malaysia. Okay? And the determination of whether or not an income is derived from Malaysia, it's a question of fact and degree, so you have to look at it on a case-to-case basis. Alright? Another thing that we need to look at when it comes to taxation is a question of whether or not you are a tax resident. If you are a tax resident in Malaysia, then clearly it's an instance whereby you need to pay taxes in Malaysia. Okay? If you are a non-resident, non-tax resident in Malaysia, there are certain instances whereby the monies that you earn in Malaysia will be subject to tax. And that's when we look at Section 4, capital A of the Income Tax Act. Okay. And remember the first slide I showed you earlier? The Lionel Messi, the Manny Pacquiao, the Lewis Hamilton. Those were all issues on tax evasion. Okay? In Malaysia, we have a general section on Anti-Avoidance Rule. And this is specifically spelled out in Section 140 of the Income Tax Act. So under this section, what the Director General is empowered to do is essentially he can disregard or vary a transaction where he has reason to believe that any transaction has the direct or indirect effect of one of these four circumstances. So essentially, where there is the effect of altering the incidence of the tax payable, where there's an effect of relieving any person from any liability, tax liabilities, evading or avoiding any duty or liability which is clearly spelled out in the Income Tax Act, or hindering or preventing the operation of the Income Tax Act in any respect whatsoever. Okay? And in determining whether a business operation is within Malaysia, these are some of the factors that we need to consider. Okay, so number one includes things like performance of contractual obligations. So in an instance whereby an association has signed a contract, question then arises, where was the performance of contractual obligations? Location where the contract's performed, location where the services themselves are performed, where the goods are stored. I mean, this is an instance whereby you're in the business of selling sports goods or whatnot, and where arrangements are made for delivery of products. Okay. With international athletes, you'll be very well aware that this is when they move from one jurisdiction to another to play games, and they get their winnings and whatnot. One of the things we look at